Imagine waking up tomorrow and the gas station near your house has no fuel, the stock market has crashed 30% overnight, and somewhere in the Persian Gulf, the world's most important waterway is completely blocked. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is happening right now. And the story behind it, the secret alliances, the hidden deals, the desperate phone calls between world leaders, is far more terrifying than anything the headlines are telling you. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the next 72 hours could determine the fate of the global economy, and why one man, sitting in a palace in Riyadh, just made a decision that nobody saw coming. Let's go back to where this all started. Not to the missiles, not to the airstrikes. Let's go back to a single moment of calculation that set off a chain of events the world was completely unprepared for. Israel, after months of intelligence work, identified Iran's South Pars gas field as the beating economic heart of the Iranian regime. South Pars is not just an energy asset, it is the single largest natural gas field on the planet, shared with Qatar, and it funds everything: the military, the proxy networks, the missile programs. When Israeli jets struck it, they weren't just blowing up infrastructure, they were going for the jugular of the Iranian state itself. Tehran understood this immediately, and what happened next was not emotional. It was coldly strategic. Iran looked at its enemies and asked one question: what do they love more than anything? The answer was simple: energy, money, stability. So Iran did not fire back at Israel alone. That would have been expected, predictable, containable. Instead, the supreme leader's inner circle approved a plan that had been sitting in a drawer for years. A plan so aggressive, so economically devastating, that even Iran's own allies were reportedly shocked when the orders went out. The targets were not military bases. The targets were the Gulf's economic spine, Ras Laffan in Qatar, the single largest LNG production facility on Earth, the port infrastructure of the UAE, Saudi Arabia's eastern energy corridor, and most critically of all, the Strait of Hormuz itself. In one coordinated sequence, Iran transformed a regional military conflict into a global economic emergency. Now here is where most people's understanding of this crisis stops. They see the fires on the news, they see the oil price ticker, and they think this is just another Middle East flare-up. But that is exactly wrong. What is happening right now is a fundamental restructuring of global power, and the man who understands that better than anyone right now is Mohammed bin Salman. Let's talk about what MBS has actually done, because this is the part that changes everything. For years, the conventional wisdom in Washington, in Brussels, and Beijing was that the Gulf states would never truly unify. Too many competing interests, too many old rivalries. Qatar had its relationship with Iran. The UAE had its own economic calculations. Saudi Arabia had its ambitions. These countries cooperated on paper but were never truly aligned in moments of real crisis. That calculation is now obsolete. Because what Iran did when it struck Ras Laffan, when it sent drones toward Dubai International Airport, when it threatened the energy lifelines of every single Gulf state, it committed the single biggest strategic mistake in its modern history. It gave MBS exactly what he needed: a common enemy, a shared wound, and a reason for every Muslim majority government in the region to finally sit in the same room and make real decisions. Within hours of the Ras Laffan strike, a series of encrypted communications went out from Riyadh. Not press releases, not diplomatic memos, direct calls from MBS to the leadership of 12 Muslim majority nations. The message was simple and it carried enormous weight. Iran just attacked all of us. What are we going to do about it? The emergency foreign ministers meeting that convened in Riyadh shortly after was not a photo opportunity. It was a founding session. And what came out of it, what was agreed in that room, is something that analysts will be studying for decades. Before we get to exactly what was decided, let me take a moment to walk you through the economic devastation that was already unfolding, because this context is essential to understanding why that meeting in Riyadh carried such historic urgency. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that 21-mile gap passes roughly 20% of all the oil traded globally, every single day. Saudi crude going to Asia, Qatari LNG going to Europe, Iraqi exports, UAE barrels. All of it funnels through that small choke point. When Iran moved assets to threaten and effectively block that strait, it did not just cut off Gulf oil, it cut off the oxygen supply to the entire global economy. Within 48 hours of the blockade becoming credible, oil prices crossed $100 per barrel. Within 72 hours, they were approaching 120. Asian markets fell sharply. European indices dropped. The American S&P 500 saw its worst single week since the early days of the COVID pandemic. Airlines began announcing route suspensions. Shipping companies started rerouting vessels on journeys that added weeks and hundreds of thousands of dollars in extra fuel costs. And governments from Tokyo to Berlin began quietly activating their strategic petroleum reserves, which are emergency stockpiles that are not designed for sustained use. They are a bridge, not a solution. Everyone understood that. The deeper economic problem is this. The world spent the last decade after the shale revolution and the renewable energy push telling itself that it was no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil. That was true on paper, but infrastructure runs on real supply chains, not ideological preferences. Europe, which had scrambled to find alternatives to Russian gas after 2022, had become deeply reliant on Qatari LNG. Japan and South Korea get the overwhelming majority of their energy from Gulf sources. Even the United States, despite its domestic production, is embedded in a global oil market where a price shock anywhere is a price shock everywhere. The economists who spent years arguing about energy transition timelines were suddenly confronted with a very uncomfortable truth. The transition had not happened fast enough. The world was still running on Gulf hydrocarbons. And now those hydrocarbons were caught in a war zone. Shipping insurance rates exploded. Lloyd's of London and other major underwriters began adding war risk premiums to any vessel transiting within 500 miles of the conflict zone. Those premiums are costs, and costs get passed on to the shipping company, to the importer, to the retailer, to you. The inflationary pressure that economists were already watching with anxiety began to look genuinely dangerous. Central banks, which had only recently managed to bring inflation under control after the post-COVID spike, found themselves staring at the possibility of a new exogenous shock that none of their models had accounted for. The Pentagon's request for $200 billion in emergency supplemental funding was not just a military budget line. It was a signal to global markets that the United States was preparing for a sustained, expensive engagement. Markets do not like uncertainty, but what they truly cannot tolerate is the combination of uncertainty and massive fiscal expansion at the same time. Bond markets began pricing in risk. The dollar, paradoxically, strengthened as a safe haven even as American finances looked increasingly stressed. Gold crossed historic highs. Cryptocurrency markets surged and then crashed as competing narratives about their role as a hedge played out in real time. The financial system was not breaking, but it was bending in ways that had not been seen in a very long time. Now let us come back to Riyadh, because while all of this economic chaos was unfolding, MBS was doing something that no Saudi leader had ever quite managed to do before. He was assembling consensus, real consensus, not the kind that gets papered over in joint communiques and then quietly abandoned, the kind that is born out of genuine shared fear and genuine shared interest. Qatar's expulsion of Iranian military and security attachés was the first visible signal of this. Think about what that means for a moment. Qatar, a country that maintained gas infrastructure jointly with Iran through the South Pars and North Dome Field, a country that had for years walked a careful diplomatic tightrope between its Gulf neighbors and Tehran, a country that had survived a Saudi-led blockade just a few years ago and had subsequently rebuilt quiet channels with Iran. Qatar publicly and formally broke with Iranian military presence on its soil within hours of the Ras Laffan attack. Qatar's prime minister called the attack a betrayal, not a miscalculation, not a regrettable incident, a betrayal. That word was chosen deliberately. And it means the bridge between Doha and Tehran is not just damaged, it is gone. The UAE's posture shifted with equal speed. When Emirati officials announced that more than 2,000 Iranian drones and missiles had targeted UAE territory since the conflict began, they were not just providing a statistic. They were building a legal and political case. A case for what comes next. The UAE's air defense infrastructure, much of it built with American technology and Israeli cooperation through the Abraham Accords framework, had performed well. But performing well under attack is different from choosing to simply absorb attacks indefinitely. Behind closed doors, Emirati leadership made clear to their partners in Riyadh and Washington that there was a ceiling on how long they could absorb. Iranian strikes without a definitive military response that changed Iran's calculus. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister delivered the most explicit public statement. The language was precise, and it was intended to be heard in Tehran as clearly as anywhere else. Saudi Arabia reserved the right to take military action if necessary. That is not boilerplate language. That is a country that controls the world's largest proven oil reserves, that hosts American military infrastructure, and that has spent the last decade building one of the most sophisticated air defense and offensive military capabilities in the Arab world, telling the world that it is prepared to enter this conflict directly if provoked further. The meeting in Riyadh brought all of this together. 12 foreign ministers, Arab states and Muslim-majority nations beyond the traditional Gulf Cooperation Council. The agenda was not primarily about diplomatic statements. It was about architecture. What kind of collective security arrangement would these nations build, right now, in real time, in response to what Iran had done? The details of exactly what was agreed remained closely held, but the outline is becoming clear from subsequent actions and statements. There is now a shared intelligence sharing protocol. There is coordination on air defense. There is an agreement on economic countermeasures against Iran that go beyond anything previously implemented. And there is, perhaps most significantly, a political consensus that Iran's behavior has now crossed a threshold that cannot simply be negotiated back from. Think about what that means in historical terms. For decades, the great project of American foreign policy in the Middle East was to build exactly this kind of coalition. A stable, aligned bloc of Arab and Muslim states that shared American and Israeli concerns about Iranian expansionism. It never quite worked. The Abraham Accords were a significant step, but they were bilateral normalization agreements, not a collective security structure. The Gulf Cooperation Council existed, but was repeatedly paralyzed by internal disputes. Every American president since Carter had tried, in one form or another, to build a coherent regional architecture that could contain Iran. None of them fully succeeded. And now, without a formal American initiative, without a grand diplomatic conference, without a treaty or a formal organization, MBS has done in 72 hours what decades of American foreign policy could not achieve. He has created the functional reality of a Muslim NATO, not in name, not yet formally, but in substance, in intent, and in the shared understanding among its members of what they are willing to do together. Iran clearly did not anticipate this. This is arguably the most consequential miscalculation Tehran has made since the 1980s. The Iranian strategic theory of deterrence was built on the assumption that Gulf states would be paralyzed by fear and divided by competing interests in any major confrontation. The assumption was that Qatar would protect its gas relationship with Iran, that the UAE would protect its trade relationship with Iran, that Saudi Arabia would be reluctant to openly confront a neighbor it could not definitively defeat in a conventional war. That assumption collapsed the moment Iranian missiles hit Ras Laffan. In trying to demonstrate that it could reach out and hurt anyone in the region, Iran instead demonstrated something very different. It demonstrated that it was willing to attack Muslim neighbors, Muslim economic infrastructure, Muslim civilian populations. And it turned every calculation those governments had made about the cost of confronting Iran on its head. The Saudi foreign minister's framing was brilliant in its simplicity. He said, and the translation captures the essence perfectly, that Iran's pressure policy had become politically and morally counterproductive. What he was saying, beneath the diplomatic language, was this: you have given us no choice. You have made the political cost of standing with you higher than the political cost of standing against you. You have done to the Muslim world what you spent decades saying Israel and America were doing to the Muslim world. You have made yourself the aggressor. You have made yourself the threat. And now we are going to respond accordingly. Let us be very honest about the risks of what comes next. Because this is not a triumphalist story. The emergence of this alliance does not mean the conflict is about to end. In many ways, it means the conflict is about to escalate into a new and more dangerous phase. Iran is not a small country. It has a large military. It has proxy networks across the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen. It has a missile arsenal that is one of the largest and most diverse in the world. It has a population that, whatever its frustrations with its own government, tends to rally around the flag when it perceives the country as under existential threat. And crucially, it has Russia watching over its shoulder, and China carefully managing its economic relationships with Tehran, neither of which want to see Iran simply collapse under regional and American pressure. The Strait of Hormuz question is the one that keeps energy ministers and central bankers awake at night. Because here is the brutal arithmetic. The United States Navy has the capability to force the strait open through direct military action. But forcing it open is not the same as keeping it open. Iran does not need a conventional military force to threaten the strait. It needs mines. It needs shore-based missile batteries. It needs the threat of fast attack boats. It needs the credible willingness to turn every oil tanker passing through into a potential casualty. And if Iran decides that losing the strait is acceptable as long as it destroys the regional economy in the process, the military calculus becomes extraordinarily complex. No American president will want to commit to an open-ended maritime war in the Persian Gulf. The costs, in treasure and in political capital, are staggering. But no American president can afford to simply accept a permanent Iranian blockade of 20% of global oil. The pressure is immense, and the decision window is narrow. What changes this equation, what MBS understands, and what the Riyadh meeting was fundamentally about, is that if the coalition of Gulf states presents Iran with a unified, credible, and sustained military and economic response, the calculation inside Tehran may shift. The Islamic Republic has survived through division among its enemies. It has survived by playing Qatar against Saudi Arabia, Turkey against the Gulf, China's interests against American pressure. If that strategy is now foreclosed, if the regional environment has genuinely shifted, then the internal politics of Iran, which are already under enormous pressure from economic hardship and public frustration with the regime, become even more volatile. That is both the hope and the danger. A regime under existential pressure does not always make rational decisions. The European angle matters here too. Europe, which spent years trying to preserve the nuclear deal with Iran and to resist American pressure to take a harder line, is now watching its energy security evaporate. Germany, France, the Netherlands, all of them are staring at winter heating costs that could become politically unmanageable if Qatari LNG remains disrupted. The European Union has been careful with its public statements, but behind the scenes, there's a fundamental reassessment happening. The era of European strategic ambiguity on Iran is ending, not because of American pressure, but because European populations cannot afford the luxury of moral complexity when their gas bills are doubling. China is the wild card that everyone is watching. Beijing has been Iran's economic lifeline throughout the years of sanctions, buying discounted Iranian oil in massive quantities and providing industrial goods that the Iranian economy could not otherwise access. China does not want to see Iran collapse, but China also does not want to see a prolonged regional war that disrupts the energy supplies that Asian economies depend on. And China has enormous economic interests in the Gulf states, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, interests that have grown substantially as Beijing deepened its engagement with the region over the past decade. The Chinese calculation right now is delicate. How do you protect your relationship with Iran without antagonizing the coalition that MBS just assembled? How do you keep access to Gulf energy while also maintaining the partnerships with Tehran that give you strategic leverage? There are no clean answers. And the absence of clean answers means Beijing is currently in a reactive rather than proactive posture, which itself is a significant change from how China has typically positioned itself in regional conflicts. Russia is watching all of this with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Satisfaction because high oil prices are good for Russian revenues regardless of where the conflict is centered. Concern because a major regional war that spins out of control could create instabilities that eventually threaten Russian interests too. Moscow has its own relationships with Iran, with Israel, with Gulf states, and each of those relationships pulls in a slightly different direction. Russian diplomacy is working the phones, but has limited leverage to actually shape outcomes on the ground. Which brings us back finally to the question that this video started with. What does this mean for you? Not for governments, not for analysts, for the person watching this, wherever you are in the world. If you live in Europe or Asia, the immediate impact is energy costs, heating, transportation, the embedded energy costs in every manufactured good you buy. These are going up, not temporarily. Until the Strait situation is resolved and supply chains normalize, which will take months even in the best case scenario, the cost of living is going to be structurally higher. That is not a political statement. It is physics and logistics. If you have investments, whether in a retirement account or directly in markets, the volatility is not over. The uncertainty premium in markets will persist as long as the conflict's endpoint is unclear. Defense stocks will continue to outperform. Energy stocks will be volatile in ways that are hard to predict. Consumer stocks will be under pressure. The broad market will be choppy in a way that rewards patience and punishes short-term panic. If you're trying to understand the geopolitical world you are living in, here is the framework that matters. What happened in Riyadh in the last 72 hours is not a detail in the Iran-Israel conflict. It is a structural shift in the Middle East's balance of power. MBS just built what no one thought could be built, and Iran, through its own overreach, handed him the justification to do it. The question of whether this alliance holds, whether it deepens into something formal and lasting, whether it draws in Turkey, Pakistan, and other major Muslim majority nations in a more formalized way, those questions will define the security architecture of this region for the next generation. We are at one of those rare moments where the world is genuinely being reorganized. The rules that governed the Middle East since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the lines drawn after World War I, the Cold War alignments, the post-2003 disorder, all of it is now in active renegotiation. And the outcome of what happens in the next few weeks in the Gulf will shape what that new order looks like. The most dangerous thing that can happen now is for any side to miscalculate the resolve of the other. Iran must understand that this is not the same Gulf it has been managing for 30 years. The Gulf states must understand that Iran, cornered and humiliated, is capable of actions that have no clear military logic but enormous destructive capacity. And the United States must understand that the window for a negotiated off-ramp, if one exists at all, is narrowing with every day the strait remains blocked and every $1 billion that evaporates from the global economy. History is being written right now, not in the way that phrase is usually used as a cliché for any moment of excitement. Literally, the decisions being made in Riyadh, in Tehran, in Washington, and in the corridors of the Pentagon this week will be in history books. The only question is what those books will say. Will they say this was the moment the region found a new equilibrium? Or will they say this was the moment things slipped beyond anyone's ability to control? We will be watching this very closely. Every major development, every shift in the alliance, every signal from Tehran, we will break it down for you as it happens. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually at stake, share it with someone who needs to understand what is really going on. Because the most dangerous thing in a crisis like this is not the missiles or the oil prices. It is confusion. And the best weapon against confusion is understanding.